The Supreme Court's 8-1 emergency ruling has shaken the entire nation. This isn't just another case buried in legal jargon. This is a decision that has sent ripples through state governments, the Department of Justice, constitutional law experts, and millions of Americans who may not even realize how deeply this affects them. We're talking about a ruling so urgent, so unprecedented in its speed and scope, that it was delivered outside the normal Supreme Court calendar. An emergency stay, a nationwide injunction, and a vote that was nearly unanimous. 8 justices on one side and only one standing alone in dissent. This decision affects states, the DOJ, constitutional rights, and several major federal cases that were already teetering on the edge. Legal scholars are calling it a shockwave. Politicians are scrambling. Law enforcement agencies are recalibrating. And the American people, most don't even know what happened. Today, you'll get the full breakdown, what this ruling means, why it's called a shockwave, and how it may rewrite everything. Stick with me for the next 15 minutes, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this decision matters more than almost anything else happening in Washington right now. So, what actually triggered this emergency ruling? Let's rewind. The case originated from a lower federal court, specifically a district court judge who issued a sweeping nationwide injunction blocking the enforcement of a federal policy that had been in place for years. The policy in question involved how federal agencies were allowed to enforce certain regulations across state lines, particularly in areas where state and federal law overlapped. The judge ruled that the federal government had overstepped its authority, effectively ordering that the enforcement of this policy be halted immediately, not just in one state, but across the entire country. This was a massive judicial move, and it sent shockwaves through the Justice Department. The DOJ immediately filed an emergency appeal arguing that the district court's ruling would create nationwide chaos, undermine federal law enforcement, and strip the government of its ability to operate consistently across all 50 states. The urgency was real. The DOJ didn't just want an appeal, they wanted an emergency stay, which is essentially a legal pause button that would freeze the lower court's ruling while the case was being reviewed. They went straight to the Supreme Court, bypassing the usual circuit court appeals process because they argued the situation was so dire it couldn't wait. And the Supreme Court agreed to hear it on an emergency basis. When the Supreme Court issued its ruling, the vote was 8-1. That's incredibly rare, especially in a politically charged case like this one. 8 justices spanning the ideological spectrum agreed that the lower court had overstepped. They granted the emergency stay, effectively blocking the district court's nationwide injunction and allowing the federal government to continue enforcing the policy while the case proceeds through the courts. But one justice dissented. Justice Sonia Sotomayor stood alone, arguing that the majority was wrong to intervene so quickly and that the lower court's concerns about federal overreach were legitimate and deserved more careful consideration. Her dissent was sharp, warning that the Supreme Court was setting a dangerous precedent by greenlighting federal authority without fully examining the constitutional questions at stake. She believed the court was moving too fast and that the emergency stay would cause more harm than good, especially to individuals and states who were relying on the lower court's protection. But the 8 justices in the majority saw it differently. They felt that allowing the lower court's injunction to stand, even temporarily, would create legal chaos, undermine the federal government's ability to function, and set a precedent that any district judge could halt national policy on a whim. The court decided it needed to intervene immediately to restore order. So, what does this ruling actually do? Let's break it down. First, the Supreme Court blocked the lower court's nationwide injunction. That means the district judge's order, the one that stopped federal enforcement across all 50 states, is now null and void, at least for now. Second, the court has allowed the federal government to resume enforcement of the policy while the legal battle continues. This is a temporary measure, but it's a huge win for the DOJ because it restores their authority to act nationally. Third, the ruling imposes certain conditions. The federal government has been instructed to proceed with enforcement in a manner that respects state authority and avoids overreach, but the specifics of what that means are still being debated. The court essentially said, you can enforce this, but don't go overboard. And fourth, the court signaled that it may take up the full case later, meaning this emergency ruling is just the beginning. The constitutional questions about federal versus state power, about the limits of judicial injunctions, and about how far a single judge can go in blocking national policy. All of that is still unresolved, but for now, the federal government is back in the driver's seat, and the legal landscape has shifted dramatically. So why is this being called a legal shockwave across America? Because it's not just about this one case, it's about the precedent it sets. For years, district court judges have been issuing nationwide injunctions blocking everything from immigration policies to healthcare regulations to environmental rules. These injunctions have become a powerful tool for challenging federal authority, and they've been used by both sides of the political spectrum. But this Supreme Court ruling just put a major check on that power. By granting the emergency stay, the court is signaling that it's skeptical of sweeping nationwide injunctions issued by a single judge. Legal experts believe this could be the beginning of a broader shift in how the court views judicial authority over federal policy. Lower courts across the country are already taking note. Some judges are now reconsidering how they issue injunctions, and some are even withdrawing or narrowing their own rulings in anticipation of how the Supreme Court might respond. This is a seismic shift in the balance of power between the federal government, the courts, and the states, and it's happening in real time. Now let's talk about constitutional rights. Does this ruling strengthen or restrict them? That depends on who you ask. On one hand, the ruling reinforces federal authority and limits the ability of individual judges to block national policies, which some argue is necessary for a functioning government. On the other hand, critics say it weakens the judicial branch's ability to act as a check on executive power, which is a core principle of the Constitution. Indirectly, this ruling touches on the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments. How? Because many of the policies that have been challenged through nationwide injunctions involve issues like free speech, gun rights, and privacy. If lower courts are now more hesitant to issue broad injunctions, it could mean fewer protections for individuals who are challenging federal overreach. In the short term, the ruling gives the federal government more leeway to enforce its policies without being blocked by a single judge. In the long term, it could reshape how constitutional challenges are litigated, potentially making it harder for citizens and states to obtain immediate relief from policies they believe violate their rights. This is a constitutional balancing act, and the scales just tipped. Let's pause for a moment to talk about just how rare an 8-to-1 vote is, especially in an emergency ruling. The Supreme Court is deeply divided on most major issues, with decisions often coming down to a 5-4 or 6-3 split. But here, 8 justices spanning the ideological spectrum agreed that the lower court had gone too far. This level of unity signals something significant. It suggests that the court sees this issue as fundamentally about the structure of the judicial system, not just about the specific policy at stake. Even justices who might disagree on the merits of the federal policy itself were willing to side with the majority because they were concerned about the broader implications of allowing a single district judge to halt national enforcement. The alignment between the Chief Justice and the conservative bloc is also noteworthy. Chief Justice John Roberts has long been skeptical of nationwide injunctions, and this ruling reflects his view that such injunctions disrupt the balance of power between the branches of government. The fact that he was able to bring nearly the entire court along with him suggests that this issue may be less about ideology and more about institutional concerns. The Supreme Court is sending a message: we're watching, and we're not going to let individual judges reshape national policy. The long-term consequences of this ruling are enormous. This could set a major precedent that shapes how federal authority is exercised for decades to come. Lower courts are already adjusting their approach, knowing that the Supreme Court is watching and that sweeping nationwide injunctions are now riskier to issue. Some legal scholars believe this ruling could lead to a formal Supreme Court decision that limits or even eliminates the use of nationwide injunctions altogether. If that happens, it would fundamentally change how constitutional challenges are litigated. Plaintiffs would no longer be able to seek relief for the entire country from a single judge. They would have to bring cases state by state, which is a much more time-consuming and expensive process. This could also affect how lower courts interpret federal statutes and regulations. Judges may be more hesitant to strike down federal policies, knowing that the Supreme Court is less likely to support broad injunctions. The direction the court is taking is clear. It wants to restore a more traditional balance of power where the federal government has the ability to enforce national policies without being blocked by a single judge. Whether that's good or bad depends on your perspective, but there's no denying that the legal landscape is shifting. So, what do Americans need to know right now? First, the immediate practical effects. If you live in one of the states that was affected by the lower court's injunction, you may start to see changes in how federal policies are enforced. Depending on the policy in question, that could mean anything from increased federal presence to changes in how certain regulations are applied. Second, you may not need to take any direct action, but it's important to stay informed. This ruling affects the legal framework that governs how federal policies are challenged and enforced, and that has implications for everything, from healthcare to immigration to environmental protection. Third, expect more legal battles in the coming weeks. States, advocacy groups, and individual plaintiffs are already preparing new challenges, and the Supreme Court may take up additional cases related to this issue. The legal fight is far from over. This is just one chapter, and finally understand that this ruling is bigger than any single policy. It's about the balance of power between the federal government, the courts, and the states. It's about who gets to decide what laws apply and how they're enforced, and it's about the future of constitutional governance in America. Pay attention because what happens next will shape the country for years to come. This ruling isn't just a decision, it's a legal earthquake. The Supreme Court's 8-1 emergency ruling has sent shockwaves through every level of government, from federal agencies to state capitals to local law enforcement. It has ignited political battles, reshaped legal strategies, and raised fundamental questions about the balance of power in America. We've covered what triggered the case, what the ruling says, how it's being implemented, and what the long-term consequences might be. We've looked at the impact on constitutional rights, the DOJ's crisis response, the state-level fallout, and the rare unity of an 8-1 vote. This is a story that's still unfolding, and the next few weeks and months will be critical. Whether you see this ruling as a necessary correction to judicial overreach or as a dangerous expansion of federal power, one thing is certain: it matters. It matters to the courts, to the government, and to every American who cares about how this country is governed. For real-time Supreme Court updates, make sure to follow this channel, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay informed because this is just the beginning, and you're going to want to know what happens next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next